Good evening and welcome to the 5th Congressional District Democratic Farmer Labor Primary Candidates Debate. I am Patty Robles, a member of the Wayzata Plymouth Area League of Women Voters, and I will be your moderator this evening. The League welcomes both men and women members and is a volunteer, nonpartisan organization. We do not support or oppose candidates or political parties, though individual members may be active in partisan activities. To avoid any bias, I was asked to serve as the trained League moderator for this debate because I do not live in the 5th Congressional District. This evening, the League of Women Voters is sponsoring 2 debates. The first debate was for the Republican candidates, and that one, unfortunately, we were unable to hold as only one candidate. The rules require us to not hold it if there's only one candidate that shows. To avoid any bias, I was asked, this is redundant, sorry. These debates are co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis and the following local West Metro League of Women Voters: Crystal, New Hope, East Plymouth, Robbinsdale, Edina, Golden Valley, Minnetonka, Eden Prairie, Hopkins, and St. Louis Park. On behalf of those sponsoring leagues, I welcome you. The purpose of this debate is to provide voters the opportunity to hear the candidates discuss face-to-face the issues that are important to you. The views expressed in this debate are those of the candidates, not those of the League of Women Voters, and the sponsorship of this debate is not an endorsement of any candidate or political party. All candidates that filed in any of the contested 5th congressional primaries were invited. The format for this debate includes opening statements by the candidates, a question and answer portion, and closing statements. On the ballot, there are 5 candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives District 5 DFL Party primary election. They are in alphabetical order: Les Lester, John Mason, Daniel McCarthy, ANTONE, MEAUX, Ilhan Omar. John Mason is feeling ill and cannot attend this evening, and Ilhan Omar was called back into session in Washington, D.C. Though she offered to participate remotely, there were too many potential failures doing a hybrid virtual studio meeting. I would like to welcome the DFL party candidates in alphabetical order: Les Lester, Daniel McCarthy, and ANTONE MEAUX. We have a timekeeper so that each candidate has the same amount of time to respond to the questions. The timekeeper will hold up a card when there are 15 seconds left and a stop card when your time is up. We ask that you finish your sentences and stop at that point. Candidates are allowed a 2-minute opening statement to include why they are running and their qualifications for the office of U.S. Representative for District 5. The absent candidates were allowed to send in their 2-minute opening statements, which could be recorded or written to be read by the moderator. Candidates drew cards before the forum to determine the order of who speaks first and for the opening statements. The first candidate, Les Lester, will go first.
Thanks so much, Patty, and all of you with the League of Women Voters for putting on such a fantastic forum. Again, my name is Les Lester. This is not a time for politics as usual. COVID-19 has accelerated us into the future. But we have too many political figures who are still looking at 1950s type politics. And they think that that's going to work in the 21st century. We have the Donald Trump types who created the Hong Kongs, where there's separation in China today. We had a capitalism that had slavery, and we literally took all of the native lands. But you know, I grew up in Mississippi during Freedom Summer. I sat in the yard and people like Stokely Carmichael and Andrew Young stopped by and visited my grandmother, who was a school teacher. And then in 1968, when Dr. Martin Luther King was killed, I was a little boy and schools had just integrated. And a white kid said, "You think you're special because Dr. Martin Luther King had been killed." I was confused. But then I began to realize the power of the media. And I went ahead and majored in broadcast journalism and worked in radio and worked as a newspaper reporter, and I'm currently a journalist now. This is the time where we must not simply follow the news cycle, where whenever there's a big outburst of something, we follow what the news is saying. We must set the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel McCarthy.
Hello, my name
15
is...
seconds. You have 15 seconds left.
Well, that's enough time for me. I'm a journalist. I try to summarize things.
Thank you so much. Daniel McCarthy.
Hello again. Yes, my name is Daniel McCarthy, and thank you to the League of Women Voters and CCX Media for sponsoring this event. Let me be quick in introducing myself. I'm a retired federal civil servant, and I'm an idea person. I have lots of relevant experience. Let me rattle that off. U.S. immigration officer doing refugee interviews, policy analysis and supervision, Desert Storm veteran, legal aid lawyer, small business owner. I put in months worth of volunteer canvassing in what's now the 5th District. 2 decades of federal service and 10 years of practicing law in varied settings give me a broad, people-oriented perspective to give voice to Metro Minnesotans for both justice and government. My background helps me see why the best medical system in the world failed so badly. As a career bureaucrat, I can see how the most senior civil servants at Health and Human Services blinked when they should have jumped. President Trump poo-pooed the pandemic, so his political appointees felt constrained from treating a nothing burger health care as a crisis. That called for agency scientists to stage a palace revolt. It was like a raging fire when they stood there, hammer in hand, poised to break the glass sounding an alarm, but they couldn't do it. The kind of person who seeks security in federal employment is the opposite of a whistleblower. So no one even leaked a warning that tens of thousands might die if the over-engineered CDC test failed, and it tragically did. Going forward, perhaps Congress should pass a law that only military veterans can occupy the most senior posts in Health and Human Services. Veterans have a better temperament to act when lives are on the line. And if the World Health Organization comes up with a test before the United States does, we should adopt that test in the, and the U.S. one later if it comes up. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. ANTONE Mountain MEAUX.
Well, good evening, and thank you for having me today, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for organizing this important conversation. My name is ANTONE Melton MEAUX. I am running for Congress because I love this district. I care about you, about our community, and how we live and how we work together. You know, the reality is the murder of George Floyd and COVID-19 has taught us that leadership matters, and it's never mattered more. And we need someone that's going to show up and do the work to bring us together to tackle the difficult problems that we face, like making sure that we have affordable and quality health care for all, that we take measured steps to address our climate crisis, and that we address the tragedy of Donald Trump's policies at our borders. I'm dedicated to doing all those things as a progressive Democrat. The problem is, the culture in Washington is toxic. Too many have given in to the politics of division and distraction. We don't need more dividers. We need more uniters. I've been fighting hard to bring people together my entire life. As a young lawyer, I fought for inmates that were in the process of gender transition, and I fought to protect their constitutional rights. I fought with the National Fair Housing Alliance to find affordable housing and fair lending for residents of the District of Columbia. And as a nationally recognized mediator, every day I fight hard to bring people together, to have the difficult conversations, and find creative solutions that they can move forward with to improve their lives and have integrity and dignity. And these are the kind of skills that I want to bring and passion for community to the 5th Congressional District, because that's the kind of representation that you deserve. Thank you.
Thank you. Will the studio now play the statement from Ilhan Omar?
Hello, Minnesota. I wish I could be there in person with you, but Congress was called into session this week for votes. This week, I get to vote on the No Ban Act, a bill I led to place Donald Trump's Muslim ban in the dustbin of history where it belongs. You sent me to Congress in 2018 to fight for you because you knew you needed an organizer, an advocate, and a policymaker. Someone who will fight for paid leave so mothers don't have to worry about losing their paycheck because their child got sick. Someone who is willing to stand up to a president who targets Muslims, women, and immigrants at every turn. You send me because you knew at this moment, half measures are not enough. That's why we have been fighting for a Green New Deal so we can have a breathable planet. That's why we've been fighting for Medicare for all, because we believe no one should die because they don't have health care. And yes, you send me to Congress to tackle systems of oppression wherever we find them. That's why we have been dreaming big and fighting hard, because structural changes need to be bold and transformative. Our movement has always been about organizing people for big change. It's been the honor of my life to get to represent you in Congress. We have been in this fight together. Thank you for fighting alongside me, and I will never stop fighting for you.
Thank you. For the question and answer portion of the debate, I will ask questions that have been sent to the League of Women Voters from District 5 constituents in advance or received during this debate. You may continue to send your questions to lwvgv@lwvmn.org. The choice of questions will be made by me in a good faith effort to reflect the interests expressed by the 5th District voters. Candidates will be given 1.5 minutes to respond to each question unless I determine otherwise. I will announce if there are any questions in the response time before I ask, and any changes to the response time before I ask the question. A lightning round may also be used with the response of yes or no and why in 30 seconds. Candidates in this debate have the option to use up to 2 rebuttals to their opponent's responses, and each candidate may counter that rebuttal. Rebuttals and counter rebuttals will be limited to 30 seconds each. We will begin with, let's see, our first candidate will be Daniel McCarthy, and rotate speaking order for each question. Our first question is, what are the top 3 issues facing our district, and how do you plan to address these? Daniel McCarthy.
Thank you. I would say that the main issues I see are, of course, in the aftermath of the appalling murder of George Floyd, there is renewed attention to the intense need for police reform in Minneapolis. And I do think that the federal government can play a role in that. And my idea for that would be, because of the authority that the federal government has to preempt all states when it comes to labor matters, as in the National Labor Relations Board, and because the federal government has prohibited the formation of unions in the military, I think that police unions should be eliminated by the federal government unless there's a comprehensive package of reforms which were imposed instead, and perhaps that could be a local option. The elimination altogether, or a set of reforms that would make a difference. Also, obviously, the continuing health and economic effects of the COVID-19. I had a few remarks about that earlier. I do think that there's a lot of federal aid that should be coming. It was the feds who basically caused this mess, and I think they do owe the states reimbursement, especially since they also did not coordinate a national response like they should have.
Thank you. Les Lester.
The 3 main areas of issues in the 5th Congressional District are COVID-19, crime, and policing. In the area of COVID-19, contrary to popular opinion, and I hope we get a vaccine, but if you look at the case of HIV/AIDS, it's been almost 40 years, and we have still not found a vaccine. Every once in a while, the last few weeks, we hear of some company who's gotten $1 billion or $2 million or $2 $2 billion or $3 billion from our government to try to accelerate the process. But given the history of finding vaccines, we're probably a little too optimistic. I hope we do find a vaccine. Meanwhile, we're in a situation now, and we may talk about schools later, but I don't think one life in the schools should be lost by rushing those children back to school. I'm a school teacher. I've had an opportunity to teach in a couple of classes over the years, and I guest teach often now. I see I've got about 15 seconds left, and perhaps we'll get into that later. But we need to be thinking of ideas outside of the box. Kids learn online from first through sixth grade, and I'll explain that further, I would hope.
Thank you. ANTONE MELTON MEAUX.
Well, the three issues are COVID-19, also addressing reimagining police functions, and then lastly, addressing healthcare. So with respect to COVID-19, it's important for us to be honest that families are still working hard to make ends meet. They've lost their jobs. So I support rental and mortgage relief for families that are in need. We also have to maintain the $600 additional allowance for unemployment, and also hazard pay for our essential workers. And we need more PPP investment for our small business owners, especially Black-owned businesses that have been decimated by COVID-19. With respect to imagining the police again, we need to have a focus at the federal level of ending excessive force by having a uniform standard in this country. We need to end qualified immunity. We also have to be sure to demilitarize the police and end police sexual abuse. We also need to have more oversight of the police, and we do need a police function. I do not believe that we have to eliminate the police, but it must be more focused, moving funds towards mental health as well as homeless support and investing more in our schools. And then lastly, for healthcare. Healthcare is a right. We all are entitled to it. If Medicare for All came across my desk, I would support it in a heartbeat. That only addresses one part, which is the access to care. So I promote something that's called primary care for all, which addresses both access to care, quality, and the cost of care. And I hope we can talk about that more later this evening.
Thank you. Speaking of health care, what plan, if any, do you have to provide the health care for Americans? How do you expect to get Congress to agree with your solution? And our first response is from ANTONE MELTON MEAUX.
Well, that's good timing. So healthcare is a human right. I said that before. We all need it. There are huge disparities, especially with Black, Brown, Latinx, and Native communities in healthcare. And I think one of the things we should talk about is Medicare for All. It is a strong program that really emphasizes access to medical care. I think that's great, but we can do a little bit better. So what I propose is called primary care for all. That addresses also the quality of care and the cost of care. Let me try to explain. All studies have shown that investments in the primary care system reduces the amount of chronic diseases, reduces costs, and improves quality of life. Right now, our healthcare system is underfunded in that respect. So I'm calling for a significant investment of federal dollars in primary care. That extends to internal medicine, prenatal care, wellness, health, mental health care coverage as well. And that's going to help us across the board in terms of driving down costs. We can also drive down costs by moving to a global payment system. That's a focus on the value of care and the quality of care, not the quantity of care. We also must legislate at the federal level to allow the government to negotiate with pharmaceuticals to drive down the cost of pharmaceuticals. This won't impact your Medicare or your Medicaid, and you have access to additional services like surgery. That's all covered. This is the kind of system that addresses access to care as well as quality and cost of care. That's the direction we should be heading.
Thank you. Daniel McCarthy.
I would favor a single-payer model of healthcare similar to all the other advanced industrial countries in the world, pretty much. And the reason I would favor that is largely because, as I said, I've been involved in federal bureaucracy for a long time, and I know that there are many inefficiencies with a lot of paperwork, and with the current system of multiple insurers and multiple paperwork requirements, when you go visit the doctor, a lot of times you see the doctor entering data as much as they are actually interacting with you as their patient. At least I've had that experience, and even with doctors that I regard as good doctors. They're basically working for the insurance companies to a large extent because that's how they get paid. So I think there are many efficiencies that can be gained to make up for the cost. And if you look at the status quo, it is so expensive and it's not giving us a very good bang for the buck, and it's more oriented towards high-tech, expensive solutions as opposed to prevention. I do agree that clinical care it should be a priority of medicine. Obviously, with the COVID epidemic, we have gotten exposure that there is inadequacy. Okay, I'll stop.
Thank you. Les Lester.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. Let's see, what was the question? What plan, if any, do you have to provide health care for Americans? How do you expect to let to get the Congress to agree with your solution?
Unquestionably, Medicare for all is the way that we need to go in the United States. We're the only major industrialized country that still doesn't have a universal health system. As far as Congress is concerned, we simply have to, Democratic Party has to gain control of the Congress. The current GOP flock of congressmen have simply become acolytes of the current guy in the White House, and they've shown that they're very entrenched, so it's going to be really difficult to get them out. But unquestionably, Medicare for all, single payer, it must not be a market-based product, I believe, going forward. My wife had to use an EpiPen, started a few years ago, and the first year she got the EpiPen, she only paid $90. Might have been $110, but roughly $90. The following year, the pen had gone up to almost $1,000. And had it not been for pressure from Congress, and apparently some of the ACA type Congress people, people would still be paying the egregious amount of money for something that's going a lot cheaper in other countries.
Thank you. We're going to stick with health for one more question. What changes, if any, do you suggest for handling the COVID-19 pandemic, since it's on everybody's mind for sure? Les Lester.
When I look at how the East has handled COVID-19, I'm certainly aware that we have a lot of our liberties we don't want to lose. And in a lot of those more authoritarian countries, they're able to do tracking better. But I think, so many people are on Facebook nowadays that we could do a tracking among friend groups. You could have friend groups to do a tracking and make each group responsible. And I think that would take away that kind of distrust that a lot of people have for tracking.
Thank you. Daniel McCarthy.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I went out of, it's not your turn yet.
Okay.
I made a mistake, so sorry.
Fine.
Antone Mountain MEAUX.
Sure. Well, it's first important to say that the response that we've gotten in the leadership from the Trump administration has been an absolute disaster. From the very beginning, Donald Trump did not take this virus seriously. He did not allocate appropriate resources for testing, and his disastrous decisions have cost people lives and has taken our economy to a deeper place of recession than it should have been in the very first place. So in terms of moving forward, if COVID is with us past November, one of the first things we have to do is to ensure that Joe Biden is elected the next president of the United States, which will help us to reset our trust in science and also make sure we're working in tandem with Congress to get the resources we need to everyday working families, small business owners, to weather the storm that is COVID-19. Congress acted in May with the HEROES Act, which was good work, but we need to do more. And I hope the Congress is taking seriously the opportunity to serve as a bridge for working and middle-class families and also business owners that are trying to make ends meet. Now's the time for Congress to act and for us to elect a new president to redress COVID-19.
Thank you. Daniel McCarthy.
I would agree with a lot of what's already been said, including I do think the Democrats need to take over in Congress for the kind of reforms that are needed in health care. Another part of what went wrong, besides what I talked about earlier, was, of course, it was a testing, but we also have had plenty of time by now to ramp up the tracking. There should have been a much better tracing of who has the disease, and then as other successful Asian countries in coping with this have identified who had been exposed to the disease and then been able to isolate people, or people would isolate to protect others while they hopefully recovered. There's an interesting sidelight on the tracing piece of it, because there are privacy concerns with people cooperating, and I think that's unfortunate. I think good leadership in the top would have been much better able to convince people that we're all in this together, and that to ignore the risk that you're imposing on someone else is like, playing Russian roulette with their life and their health. So I think part of it is just a matter of norms. And I do think that in general we should follow the science and the data, and the CDC should have been out front, leading the government response all along.
Thank you. Let's move on to another hot topic in the 5th Congressional District, and that is policing and the riot recovery from the George Floyd incident. The aftermath of George Floyd's wrongful death devastated sections of the district. Ideally, these devastated communities would be made whole again, but federal officials have declined the governor's request for aid, and at the state level, the aid that House Democrats have proposed is entangled in larger political issues. Minneapolis's coffers are dry. How would you, as a U.S. Congressperson representing these communities, help make them whole? And what does wholeness mean to you? And let's start first with Daniel McCarthy.
Thank you. I worked with police when I practiced law, and it's a very tough job that they have, but sometimes they do it very badly. And there are some bad actors within the system of just about any police department. I think it's a good time to rethink, not only healthcare, but policing. I do think we need a police force, but perhaps not so much in functions that they are not fully trained for, such as drug situations where the main issue is medical, or domestic violence. I know that the police hate to go on those calls, so they'd be happy to bring along a social worker or a de-escalation expert of some kind. And the problems with the homeless are, that sometimes it's a mental health thing, and a mental health professional would be more appropriate, or perhaps they could go out in teams with the police officer as backup, if the situation did escalate in spite of efforts to the contrary. But as I said, I think we should, cut the police unions out of it. And to the extent that, as I mentioned, a package of things could happen. I think there's a lot of good ideas out there, and that could be leveraged to make them happen.
Thank you. Les Lester.
In 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King suggested that we initiate an annual basic income. And Andrew Yang, here during early 2020, talked about a universal basic income. Most of the problems with crime and some of the mental health issues people have is because they're behind the 8 ball from young adulthood at 18 until retirement. In the United States, we have a gross domestic product today of $20 trillion. And what we need is a universal basic income of just $2,000 per individual. Congress is already talking about it. But we need leadership who thinks outside of the box and who are unafraid to make the kind of decisions that we need to make. Because when the money is in the people's pockets, they're going to spend those dollars in their local community. Local communities are going to be able to create more jobs, whether it's the Boys and Girls Club, or whether it's your local church. So we have the answer. It's basic Keynesian theory, and it's worked in the past, but we should go to the next step and initiate a universal basic income.
Thank you. Antone Melton MEAUX.
Thank you. I believe the question was about businesses.
Shall I restate it for you?
Yes, please. Thank you.
I won't restate the whole thing, but how would you, as the U.S. Congressperson representing these communities, make them whole, and what does wholeness mean to you? Given that the Minnesota coffers are dry and
Right.
the difficulties.
Right. Thank you for that. The murder of George Floyd was a tragedy really beyond description for our community, and for me as a black man in America, I felt it quite poignantly, and there's a lot of collateral impact from that, including the impact on our small businesses as a result of the civil unrest. I had a great opportunity a few weeks ago to meet with business owners on Lake Street. A lot of them are East African business owners, and we talked a lot about how the civil unrest and COVID-19, in many ways that go hand in hand, have really decimated their businesses, and more importantly, what it's done to the communities that they serve. You know, we can't forget that small businesses are jobs drivers. They are 2 out of 3 new jobs. Small businesses engage with the community on an everyday basis. They know the community. They care deeply about the community. And we have to do better by our small businesses on Broadway, on Lake Street, and many other places. What we must do first is allow federal dollars to fill in insurance gaps. We also must have lease relief for small business owners as they are trying to get back on their feet. And then making whole truly is making whole, that we have federal dollars earmarked to rebuild where necessary, provide resources so they can get back to doing what they do, which is contributing to our communities very impactfully.
Thank you. Let's see, our next question. Many Minnesota state senators balk at the Minnesota House police reform proposals by saying that policing issues are local and should be resolved by the municipalities that hire the police. Do you agree that police reform is primarily a local issue? What is the most effective role that a U.S. Congressperson can play in ensuring the safety of communities across municipalities within the district while eradicating the abuses committed by police officers hired by individual municipalities? Please specifically address the role of the U.S. congressional representative when state elected officials insist that these issues should be addressed locally. And our first responder will be Les Lester.
Well, certainly we have the congressional library where we have congressional service people who do research. And so as your congressman, I'm able to let them do some comparative analysis of what is happening in other cities, and frankly, we can look at what's happening around the world. I mean, they're on the payroll. In Eugene, Oregon, for example, you've got to be able to look at a broad base. And we look at what happened right here in the United States in Eugene, Oregon. Been maybe 20 years now since they've had the Cahoots program, where the police are peace officers, not necessarily cops or strong arm guys. Meanwhile, they have, when the calls come in, they have a social service agency, a social service department that filters off a lot of those calls so the police are not as stressed. And if they find that it's a mental health issue or some kind of social issue that social service people can handle, they handle that. So I would certainly be, what's most important, I think, is to provide research findings and then talk with key leaders around the local city.
Thank you. Antone Mountain MEAUX.
There are a number of things that the federal government can and should do in order to assist local and state governments to reimagine what public safety looks like in light of the wake of George Floyd's murder. The first thing the federal government can do is to demilitarize the police. We don't live in a police state, should not be treated as enemy combatants. We must also pass an excessive force standard, uniform standard. Only the federal government can do that. My rights should be the same and protected if I'm in Minnesota, Texas, or California. We must also end what's called qualified immunity. That's a law created by judges, not legislators, that essentially make it impossible to bring a successful misconduct case against a police officer. And then lastly, we have to end police sexual abuse. Then the federal government, within their authority, must have more oversight of police function. So I'm calling for what's called the Systemic Justice in Police Act to do just that, akin to the Voters' Right Act. In addition to that, we have to reimagine what policing looks like. We need a police function. We have to move funds from the police to support of community services, to support our homeless community. We've criminalized homelessness. We have to end that. We've also criminalized mental health crises. We must end that too and provide more resources to those friends, brothers, and sisters that are having mental health crises. That's the right approach to reimagining public safety and our police function.
Now, just a slight question rebuttal. Antone, what do you mean by police sexual abuse? I haven't heard of that happening very often in Minneapolis, in the collar cities.
So Les, what I'm talking about is what people don't know, that in many jurisdictions, it is permissible for a police officer to have sexual contact with someone in their custody if there is consent. That's true in many states across this country. But the reality is there's no such thing as consent when you're in the custody of a police officer. So the federal government should pass a law specifically to disallow that kind of contact in every circumstance, because consent is not really an issue when you're in the custody of a police officer. And it happens more times than people believe.
Most people haven't heard of that. I hadn't heard anything about that.
Thank you. Daniel McCarthy.
Thank you. So I do think that fundamentally, on the ground anyway, it has to be local control, local input into police, but there is also a role for the state and the federal governments. I agree with the concept of licensing, which can be done at the state level, but again, back to my earlier idea about a set of reforms that could be leveraged by eliminating the police union if the reforms are not adopted by the locality. The federal government has authority under labor law, I believe, to do that. The federal government has been a negative influence in the sense of providing surplus military gear to police forces, which it kind of unfortunately fosters a mentality that seems to already be there anyway, that it's an occupying force. So like the 3rd precinct, I don't know if this is a federal thing, but one idea that occurs to me is that let's make the 3rd precinct like the 13th floor on some buildings and not exist anymore, and renumber it to whatever the last number of police departments in Minneapolis is. The number after that could then be the 3rd, and that would sort of rebrand it a little bit, which they certainly need at the very least. The feds have been involved in Portland, Oregon, in a bad way, with Homeland Security, my former department.
Thank you. Our next question has to do with energy. What is your energy policy? What place, if any, does nuclear power have in your plans to address our nation's future energy needs? And what is your perspective on rebuilding natural gas pipelines? How would you balance the need between safe transportation of the natural gas with the environmental concerns? And our first responder will be Antone Mountain MEAUX.
Okay. So this question really is about how we address our carbon footprint and be good stewards of our climate. Climate change continues to be one of the pressing issues that we have, not only in this district, the state, but of course across the globe. and we must address that both from the perspective of energy, but also housing and transportation. We also must look at these issues from the perspective of equity. For too long, marginalized communities have borne the brunt of our climate choices. The first thing we have to do on the global stage is to get back on the Paris Climate Accords. Donald Trump wrongfully snatched us from that, taking us off from the global stage where our partners cannot rely upon us, and we can't monitor actors like China and their carbon footprint. We also must move to clean and renewable energies so that we move off of fossil fuels for our electrical grid. Nuclear power does have a role in that as long as there's a safety protocol that meets all of the governmental standards. We also have to be focused on a carbon tax. I think that is really important to use those dollars against large corporations so they are brought into this conversation as partners, not as adversaries. Use those dollars for a clean energy economy based upon transportation and infrastructure. And with respect to natural gas pipelines, again, we have to be very careful of the impact on our environment for those and how it impacts marginalized communities. We have to follow the science and best protocols before we move in that direction.
Thank you. Les Lester.
Yes, the Paris Accords were fantastic in that they allow each country to keep each other accountable. If Paris or if France is doing well, then certainly the peer pressure and competition makes Britain want to do well. And it goes on and on. If the United States does well, or if Canada does well, the United States will certainly want to meet whatever their level that they're saying they're going to meet in that particular year. So, and exactly, what was the question? I don't want to go too far off base here. I want to go down the artery.
The question had to do with your perspective on your energy policy, your perspective on nuclear energy, and on rebuilding natural gas pipelines.
Sure. When we think about what happened in Chernobyl maybe 20 years ago, and then certainly with the situation in Japan when we had the tsunami, that automatically disqualified nuclear energy from my perspective. It had great hope back in the 1970s when they were pushing it through the media around the world. But now we understand that clean energy is the only way to go. And COVID-19 is just showing us the delicate balance between nature and life itself. If COVID-19 can happen and change things overnight, a tear or a rift that we don't understand in one of the in the stratosphere, one of those levels, could be devastating.
Thank you. Daniel McCarthy.
It's my understanding, the last I knew, and I've been following this for quite a long time over the decades, I've always had a passion for public policy and for its impact on people, that the oil subsidies still exist, last I heard. We're still giving it maybe in the form of a tax break or for oil exploration is the last thing we need now, and if it hasn't been actively discouraged by the federal government as opposed to encouraged, then that should be part of the solution. As for the pipelines, I think that they are probably not a good investment. We need to wean ourselves away from the fossil fuels, and not only that, but it always seems like the pipelines go over Native American territory, and the historic wrongs there are only exacerbated. That's kind of a normative reason not to do that either. There's a lot of savings from Pentagon spending that I think could be achieved and redirected to climate change, because that's going to take mammoth resources to make the kind of progress that we need to make. I agree that there is environmental racism. Another thing to watch out for, and cap and trade would be a good idea that is overdue.
Thank you. Let's see. The federal budget deficit has totally ballooned, and with COVID-19 is assuredly going to get even higher. What should the federal budget, how should the federal deficit be reduced, and what are your ideas on helping that be accomplished? And we'll start with Daniel McCarthy.
Okay, as I mentioned before, as a veteran, I could see within the system the waste and the mammoth scale and the mission creep. There's the author is Brooks, and I think how how everything became the military and the military became everything, or something like that is the title of it. And it's about how Congress people will put money that they want to spend for foreign aid or some other purpose, and they'll put it into the Pentagon, and the Pentagon doesn't really, it's kind of like the cop going out with, when we should be sending a social worker, they're not really trained for other than core military missions, and yet we are very inefficiently spending some money on that. So also a wealth tax. I do agree that, and it would have to be carefully crafted because there is a constitutional limitation on apportioning the taxes between the states. But the proverbial 1% have been benefiting disproportionately to their contributions, in my opinion, and the opinion of many other people, for a very long time. And we need the money more than now anyway for all the deficits that are ballooning this year with the responses to crises and all the reinvestments that we need to make in the wake of the damage that's been done this year. So I think that deficit is a national security issue.
Thank you. Antone Melton MEAUX.
Well, I think one of the things we can do to address the deficit is to hold Congress accountable, to explain how they will pay for the bills that they propose, where the money will come from, whether it's tax base or other government funds. That's important. By way of example, Congresswoman Omar has a Housing for All bill. It's $1 trillion bill with no funding mechanism, and there's no explanation of how those dollars will be paid. I have a housing bill that calls for a $75 billion investment, amongst other things like housing choice vouchers and more money for Black and brown people to become homeowners. But I'm explaining how I'm going to pay for that. And that's going to come from repealing President Trump's onerous estate tax giveaway to billionaires and millionaires. And I think that's the kind of accountability that we need so that the deficit doesn't balloon more, and Congress is being accountable and transparent about how they will pay for their bills.
Thank you. And Les Lester.
Antone, that's some of the same tired thinking that they've been doing for decades in this country. And the fact of the matter is, we have too much scarcity thinking. This is the greatest economic nation in the world. And despite the difficulties right now, this is a very serendipitous opportunity here. With a universal basic income, we can put monies in people's pockets, $2,000 for a husband, $2,000 for a wife, $2,000 for two 18-year-olds. And people will begin to invest this money. House down the street is kind of falling apart. That's their first property. You've got very good managers. People sometimes, because they're poor, people think that they're not good managers or they're not good people. But if these people get some money in their hands, we can have a boon in this society. And frankly, you get a value-added tax. For example, you got Little Caesar's Pizza. Now, if they go ahead now and automate, they really don't even need those employees now. They can get an automated system that drops that tomato paste down on that dough, moves down the conveyor belt, drops those pepperoni on that dough, goes straight out that conveyor belt, and there's a box to get it. And they can use that extra money that from that value-added tax and invest it in the people and sell those pieces for $1 or $2.
Thank you.
I think I'm entitled to
Yes, you
a
are.
rebuttal
Thank
there.
you.
I would encourage you to read my website less on this, but I do have big ideas, including implementing a living wage with an inflation indicator. That's better than the 15 minimum wage that people are talking about. And it also holds us to a standard by which people's income will move up. They won't be priced out because of inflation. And that is something that Congress should look at. I remember when I started my first job when I was 15, that was over 30 years ago, I made $5 an hour. The federal wage right now is $7 an hour. That was 30 years ago. This plan will put money in people's pocket, but also keep them up to speed so they're not fighting to make ends meet 10, 15, 20 years from now.
Thank you. Les, did you want to rebut?
I'll
Counter-rebut?
Yeah, I'll reframe it later. Yeah.
All right. You know, we are quickly running out of time and there are so many questions. Let's go on to immigration. Immigration reform is a long-standing issue. What key parameters do you believe are required in making an immigration reform deal in Congress? And we're going to start first with Les Lester.
You know, much of the United States was once Mexico. You know, when I think about the fact that Mexico opens its arms to the United States in the 1800s, black slaves, the Seminoles, when they left and went into Mexico, Mexico protected black Americans. This antiquated borders that we have, like the French and the Germans had in Europe, we've got to get outside of the box. And in fact, we could actually be expanding the United States. I believe that Mexico could work more directly with us, and we could do in fact, we're doing a new NAFTA now. The old NAFTA was such that they didn't take into account the income. And so Mexico was able to pay people 50 cents or $1 a day or whatever, and that's why NAFTA went awry. But we can come up with some trade agreements that people won't have to leave Mexico. And we've got huge companies. Amazon is almost $1 trillion company now. We're just not distributing our wealth correctly.
Thank you. Daniel McCarthy.
Most of my, certainly almost all of my federal career had to do with immigration. And so I have a degree of expertise in there, including immigration policy. And it is a very, very difficult situation. I mean, there's really only two very basic options. Either we have open borders or we have the rule of law, and there are some hoops at least to jump through. Not everybody can come in. In a perfect world, we would have open borders. You know, in a perfect world, people wouldn't want to leave their homelands, as very few do, but they find themselves constrained by push or pull factors to come to the United States or try to do so. I think we should help the dreamers. That, to me, is a no-brainer. You know, I think that's finally going to happen soon. But the problem with the rule of law is and immigration really is the main area of stress, I think, on the rule of law. Here you have some very sympathetic people in some horrible situations, and I've seen it face to face. I've done thousands of interviews of refugees, and when what they said wasn't maybe strictly totally 100% true in their case, it probably did apply to somebody they knew, or something lesser happened to them. So I would be able to weigh in significantly with experience on this area.
Thank you. Antone Mountain MEAUX.
Well, the richness of our diverse communities is one of the great strengths of our country. But we have a real challenge, as Daniel mentioned, at our borders. We have families who have become refugees, fleeing their countries in fear of violence, and even now because of the ravages of climate change, making them water insecure or food insecure. And they come to our borders and receive almost no dignity or empathy. And in terms of the question of how we reset these parameters for a deal, it's got to start in the White House. President Trump has one of the most anti-immigrant policies we've ever had in our country, a real bias and hatred towards our immigrant community. And that has to change by first electing Joe Biden as the next president of the United States, and then As Daniel mentioned, we have to protect the dreamers. We can't rely upon the Supreme Court. That's a legislative act. We also need comprehensive immigration reform for undocumented immigrants in our country. We have to have more resources at the border to process asylum applications quicker. And then we have to really address the pushes that are moving families from their homes to the borders in Central and South America. That calls for better partnership to address the climate crisis, food insecurity, and water insecurity. I think we can do that with the new administration and much more focused resources in the region.
Thank you. Let us see. Let's do a couple lightning round questions so that we don't have a whole lot of time left so that you all can do your closing statements. The first one is just a yes or no answer, and you can take 30 seconds to explain if you absolutely need to. And the first one is, so sorry here, I lost my lightning round question. Yes or no, do you support the Electoral College as a process for determining the winner of the presidency? And Antone MEAUX, you'll go first. Yes or no, and you have 30 seconds to explain.
The answer is no. It is our process right now, but I believe that one person, one vote should win the day. And we've seen now in a number of recent presidential elections that the individual with the popular vote does not become the president of the United States. I think that's a travesty, and I think we need to make that change.
Thank you. Let's see, Daniel McCarthy.
I would give it a reluctant yes. I think that we should not lightly try to undo things that the Constitution provides. I think it would be a waste of political capital for the Democrats to fight that fight. By the time the Democrats have enough power to actually get the Constitution changed for that, they'd be the dominant party anyway, and it wouldn't matter. They'd be winning Electoral College or not in the presidential elections.
Thank you. And Les Lester.
No. The Electoral College was started because of the time zones. You got New York over here and you got California over here. We're in a position now with this COVID-19 where we're going to wind up voting via mail or internet or something anyway, so that really mitigates the whole time zone issue. Then also states like Wyoming or Mississippi that has a lower population felt that they would not have enough electors. We could still keep those electors to a degree, so it could certainly be modified.
Thank you. And now it's time to move on to our 1-minute closing statements. Let's see, right? Okay, next in order is Daniel McCarthy, you're first. You have 1 minute for your closing statement.
Thank you. I'd like to use this time again to thank you for the sponsors of this event, League of Women's Voters. And I want to get to a few points that I missed earlier. I think that Al Sharpton was right when he says some cops are cowards because they will take zero risk of their own life and have an itchy trigger finger, and that results in frequent, and then they cover for each other, which is not good either. I think to get back to immigration, remittances are important, so it's good for other countries that we end up with their people that way, but there's also a brain drain. And I think there should be some kind of a study so we could have an evidence-based result. It might actually be that the talent that the United States siphons off from the rest of the world, if they stayed where they were to begin with, everybody would be better off in that country, this country, and in the long run, and the entire world. So I did want to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Les Lester.
Minneapolis and Collier counties, despite the horrendous difficulties, these can be times pregnant with opportunity. We must get away from the scarcity thinking of the 20th century. We stand on the launching pad of a great future if we think positive, if we clasp hands, we come up with innovative solutions, and we need independent leaders. We've got political people out here who are being paid off and backed, and they wind up being lackeys, and they'll go to Congress They won't be independent, and we still won't get anything done. Ilhan Omar has had 2 years, and there's nothing substantial she's done. I personally sent her information dealing with black classical cultures and how our black youth in schools are not getting the proper information, and she just sat on it.
Thank you. Antone MEAUX.
Thank you again to the League of Women Voters for this opportunity and for this event. I often get asked what I would do the first day after I get elected. And what I say is, which is close to my heart, is I will not miss votes, first of all, unlike our current Congresswoman. And then I will meet with residents, civic leaders, local elected officials to convene what I call advisory councils on key issues like education, healthcare, and the climate. These will be my brain trust that will help me inform my policies in Washington, D.C. And I'll come back and I'll meet with them often. In addition to that, I will work hard to hire the best and brightest minds to work with me in D.C. and have the best constituent services in the country. And I will hold 12 town hall meetings with the people where you'll have invitations in advance in a public space. I'll stand at a podium, I'll let you know what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, and then I'll answer every single one of your questions. This is the kind of focus on the fifth that I will bring, the type of accountability that I will bring, and working hard with you together to overcome the challenges that we face. If you love that kind of representation, I ask for your vote and your support. And thank you again.
Thank you. To learn more about the candidates, please go to website 411.org to see our National League's online voter guide. This concludes the DFL Party primary candidates debate for the U.S. House of Representatives District 5. Thank you to the candidates for informing the voters about their views. Thanks to the viewers for all the questions we received. We had many more questions than we could ask, and the League appreciates your participation in this important part of our democracy. We thank CC Media for cable casting and live streaming this debate. A recording of this debate will be available to view in the next few days at ccxmedia.org. Now please do your part in our democracy and vote. Voters are encouraged to vote absentee by mail. Voters can learn more about absentee voting by mail, including how to request absentee ballots, at the League of Women Voters of Minnesota website, which is lwvmn.org, or at the Minnesota Secretary of State's website, which is mnvotes.org. In-person early voting is open now at Hennepin County Government Center for all voters in Hennepin County. The dates for early voting in other cities in the 5th District vary, so please check your city's website or call for that information. Again, voting by mail is encouraged. To ensure your ballot is received in time, we suggest you mail it in by August 4th. Thank you, and please vote.